Richard Shotton, a very, very warm welcome to the Humans versus Retirement podcast.
Very nice to speak to you.
Richard, it's lovely to hear an English voice. I have recorded 68 episodes of the podcast, and I think it's 80% dominated by Americans, which is lovely. I love my, you've got many American friends, and I love our friends across the pond. But I think it is actually indicative to where a lot of the research in terms of financial psychology, behavioural investing sits, right? A lot of it is out there. So it's lovely to have you on the podcast. I'm a massive fan of your work. I've read both of your books, The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice, which we're going to get into in a bit. But I'd love for you just to, in your wonderful English accent for the audience, just share a bit about you, where you've kind of come from, what led you to write these two books, and kind of really focus and niche down on a specific area of psychology and behaviour.
So my background is in marketing. I started working at agencies and had no knowledge at all about psychology and behavioural science. So I came to this as a practitioner first. And the moment that I got excited about behavioural science is a very specific one. So I had been doing some work for the NHS, so the Department of Health in Britain, and in particular, how do you encourage people to donate blood? How do you get people to give blood freely without any cash incentive? And when we had this brief, I just so happened back in about 2004 to be reading, remember The Tipping Point, the Malcolm Gladwell book? At the very back of that, he glosses over quite quickly, but he talks about an experiment called the bystander effect. That's a series of studies by two American psychologists called Latiner and Darley. And essentially, in their work, they found that if you ask lots of people for help, there is a diffusion of responsibility and everyone leaves it up to someone else. So I can remember reading this experiment just at the time we had to come up with some ideas that encourage blood donation and thinking, well, wait a minute, this experiment is articulating the exact problem we have. Now, we in Britain are going out and saying blood stocks are low in England, please donate. And everyone, or most people, are ignoring us. So I read the study, went and spoke to the creative agency and said, well, why don't we try and apply this principle and create a greater sense of personal responsibility? So stop saying blood stocks are low in England and start saying blood stocks are low in Basildon or Brentwood or Birmingham. And try to create a more tailored, personalised request. And even though it was this tiny, tiny tweak in the language that we were using in the approach, within a week or two, the impact was obvious, increased response rates, increased donation levels on the same budget by about 10 or 15%. So that got me hooked in this topic. Because I began to think, well, why aren't marketers, why aren't brands, why aren't businesses taking existing research from academia that's been done by psychologists and behavioural science and applying it to these challenges that we're all facing to make them more evidence-driven and more effective? And that got me started. And then in the intervening 20 years, that's what I've focused on. That's where I do my own research now. And as you mentioned, I've written two books on the topic, The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice, all about trying to take proven insights from behavioural science and help businesses and brands improve their marketing by basing their approaches on those ideas.
Yeah, it's truly fascinating, isn't it? Just that little example that you've given there in terms of how human beings, whether they're individuals or parts of businesses, how rubbish we are when it comes to choice and decisions, how we frame them. Is there something that's really surprised you in terms of that research that you've done when it comes to decision-making capabilities of human beings?
Oh, yeah. So I think one of the more surprising ones was about fairness and how people are quite prepared to walk away from what could be a very profitable opportunity if they don't think they're being treated fairly. The study, it's not very well known one. That's probably why I found it so interesting. It's a 1996 study by Sally Blount, who I think was at Northwestern University. She does this experiment with students. I think it extends beyond them. And she goes up to people one of the first days that they're on campus and says to the first group of students, can you come to my lab tomorrow I want you to do some psychology tests. It'll be half an hour and I'll pay you $7. And I think you get 74, 75% of people saying yes. Next group, she gives the same basic offer. She says, look, will you come to my lab half an hour tomorrow to do some psychology tests? But this time, she says a little white lie. She says, I'll pay you $8, but I'm really sorry. Earlier on, I was paying people $10, but I've run out of cash. I misjudged things slightly. Now, even though that group is being offered more money for exactly the same task, you only get 50, 55% of people saying that they'll do it. So you've gone down from 75% roughly to about 50%. And Blount's argument is one of the big drivers of human behaviour is a desire to be treated fairly. And it goes to the extent that we will turn down what are profitable opportunities. $7, $8 was a lot of money in 1996 to a student. We will turn down a perfectly good opportunity if we think we're being treated unfairly. We'll literally cut off our nose to, metaphorically, we'll cut off our nose to spite our face.
Yeah.
So I thought that was quite interesting, both as a opportunity for businesses, reframe your competitors as behaving unfairly, and you'll get people to push through their inertia to change. But also it's a bit of a watch out from a human level of be careful that you're not, let's say turning down a 45% share of something that can be very profitable because you think that the fair thing would be 50. There are sometimes these opportunities which we're walking away from, maybe because fairness clouds our judgment.
Slightly off, and we've got some questions that we've kind of talked about before that I want to get into, but I kind of want to riff on this, actually, chop it up with you a little bit on that, because I think it's really interesting. When it comes to decisions, when we know the decisions of other people, if that makes sense, right? We know what's happened. So there's this kind of herd mentality thing, right? So I think it is one of fairness, but also one of am I doing something that's completely different to everybody else? And if we, and I'll kind of link into the retirement bit properly in a second. I've got some bit, but when we think about twofold, really, I think when we think about people in retirement, and also if we are a business that is marketing to people at that stage of life, whether it is a service-based business or a product business, I do think people in retirement suffer massively from herd mentality. They're at a stage of their life where I think keeping up with the Joneses or not making kind of wild-based decisions, even though this thing is staring them in the face and it will make them happy, and they know if other people aren't doing it, there's so much outside influence for people in their second half of life in retirement now that I think it just clouds so much in relation to what they do, how they spend their money, and also how people market their service. You might want a bunch of really good people in their 50s and 60s with huge amounts of wisdom and knowledge to come and help and mentor or volunteer in your particular organization. And I don't think people do a great job in making it happen and market to those people.
I think you're right to touch on what I'm called, you said herding, I call it social proof, but essentially this idea that we are deeply influenced by what others do. So as a financial advisor, as a business, if you create the impression that you're popular, what tends to happen is that offering becomes more appealing and people are more likely to do it. And of all the experiments and insights and biases that we discuss, this is probably the one that's most widely researched. We've got studies going all the way back to the work of people like Muzaffar Sherif in the 1930s that show this is a very deep-seated influence of behaviour. There are hundreds upon hundreds of studies proving this point. I think money, especially on something like a pension, is particularly prone to social proof because Robert Cialdini, who's a psychologist at Arizona State University, is probably the man that's done the most experimentation in this area. He argues it's in situations of uncertainty that we particularly look to what others are doing. So if you know that you don't know, you think, well, if I copy what other people are doing, I've got a very good chance of avoiding a disastrous mistake. And when it comes to big long-term financial decisions like a pension, most people who are consumers aren't spending a huge deal of time thinking about them. It's a complex, unknown, confusing thing. And so therefore they deal with that uncertainty by often looking to what others are doing. And I think there can be a danger there because it's not always the ideal decision-making tool.
Real life example, Richard. I mean, I think one of the themes that connects choice to retirement is that emotional kind of choice, right? The emotional reaction that we have. And in the UK, we recently had the budget, and it had some quite far-fetched outcomes that were being either kind of tested by the government or made up by the press in terms of what would happen to people's pensions. And one of those things that got out there was the government were going to either abolish or reduce significantly the amount of tax-free cash that you could get out of your pension. And I saw and witnessed so many people drawing and ripping out all of their tax-free cash based on the hearsay of a paper, their mate down the pub that told them he's doing the same thing or she's doing the same thing because, and this kind of the decision and the choice that they made to do that is detrimental to their long-term financial future. But emotionally, because again, I think people know that the retirement timeframe, the retirement years, second half of life is so important that they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to get it wrong. But that creates the opposite effect. They get too emotional and they end up making some of these decisions based on what other people are doing or what the newspapers say. And it's really, really damaging.
Yeah, it is a really deep-seated driver of behaviour. I think there's two reasons why this herding pattern occurs. I think one is an evolutionary one, which is for most of our evolutionary history, living as hunter-gatherers in small tribes, we depended on groups to survive. The ancient Greeks used to have a punishment called ostracism. They would literally send you out of the city, and the expectation was you wouldn't survive very long because humans are pretty weak on their own. So part of the reason we herd is we have this evolutionary inherited trait of a deep fear of exclusion and being avoided by our peers. But I do think there's another part which is slightly less nefarious, which is essentially this idea of, in a situation of uncertainty, how do you know what decision to make? And often in a commercial setting, you'll have all these big businesses and brands saying, we're amazing, trust us, we've got all these great reasons to buy, Fidelity or BlackRock or whoever. But people think, well, those brands would say that, they've got this vested financial interest to spin the truth. But they think to themselves, all these other people, all these other independent decision makers, these other pensioners, well, they're neutral. They are just trying to maximize their own financial benefit. So if I copy them, well, at least should be a more unfiltered guide to what to do. So I think it's a mix of this fear of exclusion, but then secondly, a deep-seated belief that there is a wisdom in the crowd. And in many, many situations, it can actually be quite a useful tactic. But I think when it comes to finance, you've probably got all these areas of bubbles and fads and fashions where social proof essentially goes wrong.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Just on that, you mentioned, you kind of mentioned the rationale, I think, for decisions. Do you think that people, and again, I'll kind of bolt it into the retirement phrase or phase of life, but in general, people and businesses, etc., are people too focused on the outcome of the choice, not necessarily why they made the decision or choice in the first place? I.e., and Annie Jukes written a lot about this in her great books, but it's, you can put it into a sporting context, right? The decision to do play X resulted in a failure, but actually all of the rationale behind that decision was perfect. It just, the execution was a little bit wrong or a bit of bad luck went against you. I play a lot of golf, and that's the same thing, right? It's kind of, I can hit the best drive in the world and walk down there and it's in a divot that I've got no hope of playing from, particularly in retirement. Do you think people are just kind of, if you're too focused on the outcome, the decision-making process is clouded somewhat?
I think so. You mentioned golf. I don't know much about golf, but I think there are definitely football analogies. I can still remember the Champions League final. So it was definitely Chelsea. I think it was Chelsea, Man U. And it was decided by penalties. And John Terry slipped. I think slow motion, you can see a bit of the ground, the bit of the turf sliding, and he slips, hits the post or just misses the post, and Chelsea go on to lose. And I can remember reading the editorial afterwards, And it was all talking about the ageing midfield of Chelsea and how they'd been outplayed and it'd been this huge mistake to rely on these kind of stalwarts for so long, and they'd missed the moment for rebirth and regeneration. You think, well, the exactly the same team, if the post had been an inch to the left and the turf had a bit more solid, they may well have won, and then the editorial would have given a completely different explanation. So I do think you're right that we overly focus on the outcome and we forget that there is a large degree of randomness, probably because the outcome is something that it's very easy to quantify and categorize, whereas all those uncertain, nebulous reasons are a little bit grayer.
Yeah, no, I agree. So when we were talking before, and we've had a couple of conversations, emails, etc., around trying to really think about connecting choice to retirement and stuff like, choice overload and how we frame our choices, the emotional side of things that we talked about, how to be empowered to make decisions, etc. But one of the things that we did touch on before we hit record was about spending money. And I think, one of the key choices that people have in retirement is how to and how much they spend of their hard-earned savings. And, a lot of the work that I do and I talk about is in relation to people probably quite significantly underspending because of all the wonderful bits about us as human beings and all of our heuristics and cognitive biases that we have. So I'm really interested to get your understanding about some of these common human characteristics that people will face when they make choices about spending their savings, and really how they can think about overcoming them.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. And this is one of the great things with behavioral science and psychology. There are so many of these experiments. I think whatever aspect of human nature you look at, you'll find something of interest and practical value. And when it comes to spending, there's some wonderful work out there. And a lot of the research suggests that people don't optimally convert the cash in their bank into units of happiness. And there's a few repeated ways in which they seem to make mistakes. So one of which is shown with a lovely experiment by Elizabeth Dunn, who was at the University of British Columbia. So back in 2008, she worked with Michael Norton, recruits a group of people, and she asked them a few questions about how happy they are at the moment. And then she gives them either $5 or $20. And then she says to them, either spend the money on yourself, spend the $5, you've got to spend it today, spend the money yourself, and then come back and report later on this afternoon, or spend it on someone else. So you've got to either spend it on yourself or spend it on someone else. And she randomizes people into one of those groups. And what she finds is when people come back, it's actually the group who've spent on others who have had a greater increase in their happiness than people who've spent on themselves. Now, that's fascinating because it runs counter to how most of us spend our money. If we are looking for retail therapy, we generally go out and treat ourselves. It's only a small proportion of the average person's disposable income goes on others. But what Dunn and Norton say is actually you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck. You're going to get a greater injection of happiness if you spend it on other people. Now, the other interesting element to their study was that the boost in happiness wasn't related to the amount that was spent on others. So remember, some people got $5 to spend, some people got $20. The boost in happiness didn't lead to much of a difference. So their argument would be spending small sums on lots of other people is a very good way to boost your own happiness. There's an enlightened wisdom in being generous. So that's one of the first studies that's interesting. The second study that I really like around more effectively spending cash is a slightly less altruistic one, but it's a 2010 one from Thomas Gilovich, who's at Cornell. And he did a really simple experiment, recruits a load of people, and to half of them he says, I want you to think back to the last time you received last time you spent $100. And some people start thinking about an experience they spent. Some people start thinking about a purchase that they bought. So it can either be a physical item or an experiential matter. And he asked them how happy those purchases made them. And what he finds is the people who were thinking about the experiential spend, they talked about a 13% bigger boost in happiness than those people who think about spending money on a material purchase. So his argument is, again, the same amount of money, if you spend on an experience, tends to lead to greater boost in happiness than if you spend it on a physical item. So I think another insight from psychology around retail therapy that involves physical items, better cars, better monitors, better TVs, we tend to acclimatize them quite quickly. But if you spend money on a time-limited experience, going out for a nice meal, going to the theatre, those things leave us happier for longer.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, one of my most favourite books, and I've quoted it a bit, is Die with Zero, Bill Perkins.
Okay.
A great book, and he talks about retirement memory planning or memory dividends, and it's that kind of thing, right? If you spend your money on experiences, it's an experience that you recount with people over time. That experience isn't a one-time happiness hit. You've got happiness hits as you go along in life. And in fact, on a number of occasions, the happiness goes up because as you recount your story with your 10-year-old grandchild, you went, what I mean? So yeah, I think it's fascinating, retirement memory planning or kind of thinking about memory dividends, when it comes to how you spend your money and all of the research about what experiences do to us in terms of our happiness is so vital for people to understand.
Yeah, I hadn't read the book you mentioned, but there's the first two psychologists I mentioned, Dunn and Norton, who did the work on spending money on others leads to a greater happiness boost than spending ourselves. They wrote a brilliant book called Happy Money, which I would strongly recommend. And they have essentially 10 themes-ish through the book, like spend on experiences, not material goods, spend on others rather than ourselves. And each one has a lovely evidence base. So it's not just them speculating. There's actual test and control experimental evidence to show the genuineness of the insight.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. It's behind me for anyone that's watching on YouTube. It is there. Richard's got his copy to hand as well. We shared our copies.
Yeah, I think I got mine out for Christmas.
So Christmas is interesting, isn't it, right? Because, we were talking about Christmas before we hit record. We've got children. Yours are a little bit older than mine, but not massively, roughly the same age. And we were talking about how, Christmas slightly changes. But ever since I've had kids, it's, I get much more happiness and joy seeing them unwrap their presents than I unwrap mine, right? I mean, it's, again, irrespective of how much has gone into that present, giving experiences, and actually the best presents I love to give are tickets to a concert or something that we're going to do together. I think that the biggest thing for me is that the word choice is, the definition is that we are choosing. That may sound stupid. It's in our grasp to choose how we do this. We shouldn't let, as we touched on before, pressures dictate our decisions and our choices. They should be unique to us. And there is huge amounts of evidence that suggests there are good choices when it comes to spending our money. As you said, spend it on other people and spend it on experiences are two amazing ways that you can bring happiness and joy to your life and feel like you are doing good with your money. And the clients that I work with, that I talk to them about this stuff, they're a joy to speak to because this isn't just baked in a book, Richard. This is real. I see it every day for people that I work with that intentionally spend their money on things that they value, on experiences, and help their friends, family, and causes that are close to their heart. They are the happiest people at this stage of life.
Yeah, the thing you mentioned there about spending money on what's close to their heart, I think is an interesting one because there's quite a lot of experimentation that suggests we're often quite bad at that, and we confuse the amount of cash on the happiness we'll get from it. So there's a brilliant study with wine. So the psychologist Baba Shiv, and he's at Stanford, lovely study, gets 5 different bottles of wine, and I'm emphasizing the word bottle, puts very prominent price labels on them, and gets people to sample tiny little sip or so from each of the bottles, and they score the wines out of 10, and then they write a few adjectives about what they think of the wine. Now, the twist in the experiment is, although there are 5 bottles, there are only 4 different wines. One of the wines is repeated. So what you've got is people drinking a Merlot they think comes from a $5 bottle and rating it. Later on, they're drinking what they think is a different wine, a $45 Merlot. It's actually exactly the same liquid. And what Shiv finds is there is a 70% variance in ratings. When people drink the wine from that $45 bottle, they rate it 70% better than when it comes from the $5 bottle. So his argument is partially what we experience is what we expect to experience. And if we think something's going to be amazing, we look for confirming evidence. One of the rules we have in our mind is if it's more expensive, it's going to be higher quality, therefore I expect to enjoy the taste more. So you could think about this in lots of different ways. You could say to yourself, frankly, if you get the enjoyment from the wine and you've paid the extra $40, who cares, even if it is the same physical item? You could think that. Or you could think to yourself, well, what are all the things in my life that I throw cash out and I've never tested? I've never tested whether I'm actually getting more enjoyment because of the underlying thing or just my positive expectations. And there might be a few ways people can save considerable amounts of money.
Yeah. I think it comes down to that, this stage of life isn't something that you walk into, right? There's a lot of work, introspection, self-discovery that's needed. And actually you've almost got to unlearn everything that you've learned throughout your career to then kind of challenge those inbuilt assumptions and behaviors that you've kind of come accustomed to.
Well, I mean, that is easier said than done. There is a big behavioural body of experimentation around the idea of consistency, that people want to be consistent with their past selves. There's a famous study from Robert Cialdini back in the 70s, I think it was 1978, where he does it on students again, but again, I think you could extrapolate it in this case. And he goes up to some people and says, will you come to my lab at 7 a.m. and I'll pay you a few dollars to do some math puzzles? And you get barely anyone agree. What student wants to get up at 7 a.m. to do some math puzzles, even if it's for a few dollars? So let's say, I can't remember the exact number, let's say it's 20% of people agree. Next group, he says, will you come to my lab tomorrow? I'll pay you a few dollars. And all you have to do is some puzzles. Most people agree because it's a nice little bit of cash for not much effort. And then he says, oh, by the way, I'll be at 7 a.m. Now, even though he ends up with exactly the same offer, 7 a.m., a few dollars for a little bit of work, proportion of people who agree to come roughly doubles. Let's say it's about 40%. Let's remember it. His argument is once people have made a step on a journey, once they've said that they're going to do something, they feel beholden to those past statements, even if it leads to an unwanted outcome. So he talks about this bias of consistency and commitment. Now, when it comes, I think, to retirement, you have this problem. You've spent 40 years focused on being a good saver, being responsible. And then you have this switch in which it's time to start enjoying some of those fruits of your labour. But the insights around consistency suggest people feel this deep cultural pressure to maintain consistency with their past behaviour. So that switch from saver to spender is probably something we don't do enough because it feels like we're being hypocritical.
Yeah. You've done work with the nudge unit, haven't you? Or you know of them?
I know, yeah. So most of my work is rather than governmental, it's more businesses and brands.
Yeah, but the nudge unit, in terms of what that did, done a big thing in terms of auto enrollment, right, in the pension markets.
Gosh, yeah.
So, we're talking about like behavioural nudges and interventions to help people, behave better and make better choices. And obviously one of those, and it's been hugely successful both in the States and over here, is to kind of give people the not the ability to opt in, but the ability to opt out. So the default is you're in and you've got to say you're out. Whereas it wasn't that long ago, was it? Was it 10 or so years ago? The
Yeah,
default was
2013, I think.
2013.
Yeah. It
The
was all kind of
default,
stepped depending on the size of the company, but yeah.
that's it. But the default was you had to opt in. And so they were like, well, not enough people are opting into saving. So the default needs to switch. And there was some monumental take up in, because people, again, you didn't do it. But I think that's also ingraining itself in the kind of the saving habit that we get now. That it's done such a wonderful job. I think it's actually hurt the spender more, because it's like, well, actually, I've been nudged into thinking and knowing that saving is really important. But there's no behavioural nudges or interventions that they're out there at the moment to help retirees make better decisions about spending their money and their time.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big drivers of why that intervention was so successful is that it focused on making something easier rather than trying to change appeal and motivation levels.
Absolutely.
So in the last 25 years, there have been 2 behavioural scientists who've won the Nobel Prize for economics. So Daniel Kahneman in 2002, Richard Thaler in, I think, 2019, maybe 2017. And what's interesting is when those 2, people at the luminaries, pinnacles of this field, when they have been asked what is the single biggest thing they've learned about psychology and behavioural science, they both give exactly the same answer. They both say of all their experiments, the single biggest finding is the importance of making whatever you want to encourage as easy as possible. There's a lovely driving analogy into this from Tim Harford. He says, look, basically there are 2 ways to change behaviour. You can motivate people to change, make that new behaviour appealing and fun and desirable. Essentially, he says you can push down the accelerator. But he says the other broad way of change is to make it easy. You can release the handbrake. You can identify small barriers that are stopping people and put a few more efforts into resolving them. And the key insight from people like Thaler and Kahneman is that we tend to overestimate the impact of making something more appealing. We tend to underestimate the impact of making something easier. Small, seemingly trivial barriers have a disproportionate effect. So if you want to eat fewer crisps, like this is a thing close to my heart, the appeal thing would be like read ultra-processed people, build your motivation levels to really be keen on a healthy diet. That would be about motivation. But if you went for the friction approach, in this case, making it a little bit harder, it'd be saying, okay, well, don't have crisps in the house. Yes, there's a corner shop 20 yards away, but that 30-second effort will put you off most of the time. If you want to change behavior, I would say the biggest thing you can do is focus on friction. If you want to encourage something, make it slightly easier. If you want to discourage something, make it slightly harder. And even if those little barriers feel inconsequential, they'll tend to have an outsized effect. And your point about defaults, to me, is one about ease. You've made it, I had to do 5 minutes of effort to get enrolled. Now I have to do 5 minutes to get myself out. And it was that 5 minutes of administrative work that had such a big effect.
It's so interesting you say that. That there's a huge mounting body of evidence that's mostly undertaken by my really good friends Michael Finker and David Blanchett in the States that talk about retirement spending, but they talk about the fact that people find it easier to spend from income than they do from capital. So you think about defaults and making it easy, and actually the research is quite startling. People that have a guaranteed level of income in retirement, so this income is forced to them, right? It lands in their bank account. It's a defined benefit pension or guaranteed income, spend about twice as much during their retirement life than people that have a pot of money. So people find it harder to spend from capital than they do from income because spending from income is easy, right? Spending from capital takes a lot of effort and time to draw it and how much and am I taking too much out and all this stuff. And they've got a great paper called The License to Spend. And I think they're updating it at the moment to be released very soon. But it found that on average, if someone was given either $140,000 or $10,000 a year, the $10,000 a year is what the $140,000 would buy as a kind of an annuity. 60% of people said they would find it easier to spend the $10,000 than they would to spend any of the $140,000. And I think that's why, when we start thinking about how to get a spending mindset, guaranteed income is really important because it's taking away the decision, right? It's making it easy. Here's the money, go spend it. You haven't got to go get it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really nice. I think that's a really nice point, and I hadn't heard about their research, but it definitely fits with some broad themes in psychology. So one of the most experimented on ideas is something called loss aversion. So it's essentially the idea that the mathematically equivalent loss and gains are not treated equally by people. Losses loom larger in our minds than gains. So if that sounds a bit woolly, there's a lovely experiment from Elliot Aronson that demonstrates it. So he goes around, this is a 1988 experiment, knocks on people's doors and tries to sell them loft insulation. And he gives them a 3-minute talk on the importance of loft insulation. And then sometimes he ends the talk by saying, if you take out this insulation, you'll save 75 cents a day. And about 40% of people want to go to the next step, find a bit more information. But the other half of the houses he visits, he gives them exactly the same talk, but he ends by saying, if you don't take out the loft insulation, you'll be wasting 75 cents a day. So this second group have got, from an economist's point of view, exactly the same bits of information. It's all about 75 cents. But by emphasizing you'll be wasting this money, you'll be missing out on it, you'll be losing it, he sees the proportion of people interested in finding more information goes up to about 60%. So you've got this 50% greater persuasive power by focusing on the loss rather than the gain. Now you take that idea of loss aversion, this fear of losing out, this fear of risk, and then you think about the situation someone's in when they've got a 140k lump sum. The problem I had if that was me would, how the hell do I know how long I'm going to live? How do I know whether I'm going to live 10 years into my retirement or 20 years? You know, an actuary can say what's going to happen if there's 100,000 of us and be very specific. But me as an individual, there's a huge level of uncertainty. So that fear, I think, of that that horrible situation of penury and running out means that most people will overcompensate and oversave, not spend enough money. So I think your point of an annuity having a benefit above and beyond its mathematical strengths is a really good one. We have an operating system as people, we've got these biases. They do exist. You might as well think of ways of working with them rather than trying to stick your head in the sand and ignore them.
I totally agree. I think that, I think where some of this has gone wrong, as I've seen, and as more of this work gets out into the wider public, I'm having people that are sitting down with me that have read about this stuff. They understand it and they see it as something they've either got to avoid or change. It's like, oh, I need to avoid that and I need to change my mindset. And I'm like, well, they're called biases and heuristics for it. They're kind of inbuilt. And to change it, why don't we lean into them? Why don't we find the things that can help us overcome them? We don't have to kind of go, well, actually, I need to be in a point where my losses don't hurt twice as much as my gains. It's like they're always going to hurt, no matter what happens.
Yeah. It's a bit like saying I've got to be in a situation where sawing off my finger isn't going to hurt. I mean, we could all, like King Canute, hope that's true. But I think you're right when it comes to that loss aversion. If there is a financial product that essentially works around that, the annuity, then that I think is the more sensible approach than trying to stick your head in your sand when it comes to human nature.
Yeah. And we mentioned maybe the negativity of herd mentality, but actually some of the positivity is when you get, data that's, that really stands on your side. If all of these people are spending more and that there's more people saying that this is right for them, then we need to learn against that. One of my big things about a modern day retirement is that people retiring now are kind of first generation retirees when it comes to this way of retiring. My parents, your parents, my clients' parents retired completely different to the way that people are retiring now. And so there is no blueprint, really. There is no one to really look up to. So the more studies that come out, the more we've got 10, 15, 20 years of spending habits and data, I think the more that we as financial professionals and the public that are retiring needs to pay attention to kind of the outcomes of this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that makes absolute sense.
So there's two more things I want to touch on, and I want to lean into your work that you do on a corporate level a little bit now, and the work you do through kind of marketing and how you can start kind of framing communication, etc. But just before we get there and kind of kind of going into that area, I just want to talk about something that I think about a lot, and that this is kind of the paradox of choice. And I think this comes to individuals as well as businesses, corporates, marketing departments, financial advisors, etc. I think retirees and everybody today have more choice than ever, right? Whether it's traveling, hobbies, financial products, social media, ways to get messages out there, working in retirement, whether we want to do consultancy or not, and the ways that we can kind of market ourselves as people. Do you think that for a modern day retiree, a modern day business, people that want to contribute, does this abundance of choice create massive challenges?
Absolutely. So the original experimentation to what's become known as the paradox of choice or choice paralysis goes back to, I think, 2000. And there were two psychologists called Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper. I think we're at Columbia University. And they do a lovely experiment in a fancy supermarket in America, a posh supermarket called Draeger's. And they set up a stall selling jam. And sometimes there are 6 varieties of jam: blueberry, raspberry, strawberry, whatnot. Other times the stall has 24 varieties of jam on sale. And what they found, the headline finding was, when there are that greater variety of jam, more people stop and look at the selection, just as you'd expect. There's more chance that their favourite taste might be their favourite flavour. But when it comes to sales, they found something quite counterintuitive. They found that actually more people bought jam when there was the limited variety. So they called this the paradox of choice, or choice paralysis. And their argument was, if the act of picking becomes onerous, what often happens is people throw up their hands and think, well, I can't be bothered. I'm not going to do anything today. I'll worry about it tomorrow. They just walk away. So there is an argument that we think the way to increase sales of products is just give more and more variety. But in certain sectors, amongst certain audiences, especially people who are maybe new to a category, aren't particularly interested in the category, actually by giving them greater choice, you can end up paradoxically leading to fewer sales and less satisfied customers.
Yeah, I love that study, the jam study. I think it's great. There's like a little fable I got told years ago about the donkey that goes into a barn, and there's like 2 juicy hay bales that are just in front of them. And by the time the donkey's going, well, which one looks a bit bigger and which one's got,
Yeah.
and by the time that he's made a decision, he's like died of starvation, right? It's kind of like, just choose a bloody hay bale and eat it, for God's sake. And I think it comes back to that optimal, I think in today's society, we're trying to optimize every decision to be its best, when in fact, just making a decision is often better, right?
Yeah. And I think I love that, the donkey story. I think I've heard it called Burradon's donkey, after some kind of
That's it. Yeah.
14th century monk or so who came up with the idea. And I had a chat with a brilliant author called Seth Stevens-Davidovitz, and he had a lovely way of framing some of those decisions. He said, look, if you're ever having a decision where you've got 2 options and you've taken an age weighing the two up, you just can't come to a decision. He says, well, basically what you've learned is that they are almost as good as each other. So frankly, flip a coin, do either. It won't really matter. When it gets to that level of inability to distinguish them, that's when you know that either choice is as good as the other. And I've actually found that phenomenally liberating. And if I ever get to a stage where I'm weighing up options, comes that realization, it really doesn't matter. Let's prioritize time over that kind of supposedly perfect.
Yeah. I'm going to get this a bit wrong, and you might pick me up on this and have heard the story, but there's something I heard once about, I can't remember where I heard it from, but it's the magnitude of the decision is often in reverse in how easy it is to make. So I think they've done this thing where there's like a boardroom of high-flying executives.
Yeah.
And when it comes to actually the direction of travel of the business, they make decisions really quickly. When it comes to what snacks to put in the snack machine, they have like a 2-hour debate about what happens, because it's going to affect. Like, that's a thing, right? It's kind of like, it's if you're au fait and maybe skilled in the thing you're making a decision, but if you don't know about it and it's got knock-on effect on certain things, you debate it till the cows come home and you never make a decision on it.
Yeah, so I've heard that story, and I guess there's always there's a slight different category. There's sometimes there are ideas like choice paralysis or social proof or loss aversion, where people can take a theory, a very pleasant sounding theory, and then put it to the test. But then I think there are others like Burridon's donkey, or the paradox you were mentioning around where we spend our time thinking, which I think are logically very plausible, but I've not yet seen anyone put it to an experimental test. So I'd have a different degree of certainty
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the two things. And then, in fact, actually, even when it comes to these experiments we're discussing, they're not all equal. Social proof, which has been experimented on hundreds of times, I would have a very great degree of certainty it's going to occur again. You go to something like choice paralysis, and again, there's been a huge amount of work. So even though that the JAM experiment has drawn some criticisms, there are enough similar studies which show that in certain circumstances, like people don't care about the category, they don't know about the category, or the choices are positioned poorly, it is a reputable finding. But you can go all the way down to things like priming, where it's one-off studies and they're all a little bit hokey, and people struggle to replicate them, where you probably want to treat some of the experiments with a very healthy degree of
Yeah.
skepticism.
Richard, I've got one last thing I want to talk to you
Mm.
about in the next few minutes.
Yeah.
I think, that this podcast is, and I'm really grateful for everybody that listens to it. And there's a mixture of people that are thinking about retirement and planning their retirement, as well as financial advisors and planners who are listening to these conversations and trying to, I suppose, up their or think about how to communicate this stuff to their clients. And I'm all about trying to get this message as far and wide as I can and help other advisors where possible. And I do think, when I say financial advisors and planners often struggle, I'm putting myself into that category completely. I think we struggle to communicate well to people in general, right? It's a big thing. There's lots of courses and people talking about how to communicate, particularly when it comes to money and the emotional lightning rod that money gives to, that it is to people. But I do think there's a particular lack of ways to effectively communicate in a way that resonates with retirees and this modern day retirement in which they're entering, particularly when it comes to spending their money. All of the textbooks that most financial advisors go through and all of the learning is about saving and about investing, but very little is around spending and how to communicate that. Putting your marketing, social hat on and how we can start to, communicate this to the public. What tips have you got for advisors and planners about framing their communication techniques and to make these choices feel less daunting?
So a couple of things. I think one problem that I see repeatedly in serious subject matters like finance or pharmaceuticals is the unnecessary complication of advice. Because often the expert thinks the way to show their expertise, to signal it and to get the respect of the client is to speak in a highfalutin way. Unfortunately, that tends to backfire. So this might be the greatest ever academic paper title. It's by Daniel Oppenheimer, who's at Princeton, and I think it was 2009-ish. And the paper title is Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilize Irrespective of Necessity. Then there's a colon.
I've lost you already. Already.
Well, that's the point. And then the final bit is the problem with using long words needlessly.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
And what he does is recruits a group of people and shows them, the first half of people, a abstract from the beginning of an academic article. So that's the little précis that goes at the front of a journal. And it tends to be typified by unnecessary jargon and complex language. He gets that group to read the abstract and say how intelligent they think the author is. Then he gets another group, reads the same basic abstract, but this time Oppenheimer has replaced complex terminology with simple alternatives. And it's that second group who rate the author as more intelligent. And we're talking about the order of about 13 or 14% more intelligent. So what Oppenheimer argues is if you want to signal your quality and expertise, don't fall for the mistake of thinking you need to use jargon and complex terminology. Not only will it befuddle the audience, they'll think worse of you. So if I could advise financial planners to do one thing differently, it would be use simple, plain English when you're trying to persuade. I think that would be one very simple thing they could do.
And yeah, no, I totally agree. I think part of the problem is that that's just not taught, right? It's just not taught. So I think simplicity of language is absolutely key. I think you mentioned another one around if we're trying to resonate with retirees and help them make some of these choices that we've talked about previously, having the ability to demonstrate you can do it, right? Social proof and stories. I know, stories are hugely powerful for human beings. What are your thoughts around how we as planners and advisors can be better at that?
Yeah, so when it comes to stories, if you want someone to remember something, avoid abstractions, talk in concrete terms. So what I mean by that is an old study, a 1972 study by Ian Begg. He recruits a group of people and reads out a list of 10 two-word phrases. And half of the phrases are what he calls abstract phrases. So these are intangible things you cannot visualize, like basic truth or subtle fault. The other half of the words he reads out are concrete phrases, tangible things that you can visualize, that you can picture, like a white horse, like a square door. Begg reads this list. Remember, it's half concrete, half abstract. And then later on, he asks people to recall as much as they can. And his key finding is people on average remember 9% of the abstractions, but 36% of the concrete phrases. So we are 4 times more likely to remember the concrete over the abstract. This is because, according to Begg, vision is the most powerful of our senses. So if you use language people can visualize, it is very sticky, very memorable. If you use abstractions people can't visualize, completely forget it. So maybe if you are trying to give people advice that you want to stick, you've got to move out of that realm of abstraction that often experts are very comfortable with, security, peace of mind. And you want to turn it into something people can visualize. And if it's a story that has a character, a person, and something happens to their house or their objects, that suddenly is becoming, you're using visualizable things, and therefore it will stick in people's mind. So yeah, moving from the realm of abstractions to simple stories that people can visualize, that is absolutely a key memory technique.
Yeah, and I can attest for that study because you done it on me at the conference that we went to, and I think I was dead on the percentages as well.
Okay,
like, what is Richard doing? I was like, I can't remember any of that. The square door, white horse, got that. But it's absolutely true. And actually, just one final thought for me before we wrap up is that vision thing that you just talked about is crucial for advisors creating but it's crucial for people entering into retirement. I cannot tell you how much a difference it makes if you can visualize what you want it to look like, if you can create a vision for what you want your life to look like, if you can put some context around, who you want to spend it with, what does it feel like, what does it smell like, what does it look like, it's so powerful both from a corporate level and an individual level.
I love that because a pension pot of £1 million or 800,000 or 400,000, frankly, they're almost interchangeable numbers. Mine, I can't do anything with them. But if you say, okay, well, this one means 2 holidays a year, and you can turn the heat up as much as you want. This amount of money means you're going to have to watch the thermostat and not go on a foreign holiday. Suddenly, though, they've become real. They've become imaginable. They've become concrete. That is, much. People will remember those stories much better, and it's likely to change their behaviour much more effectively.
Richard, look, it's been such a wonderful conversation. I thank you so much for your time. We've squeezed this in just before you set off on presentation. Well, I think you've got many months on the road, right? That you're going to be out there talking. So
January to March is often kind of conference season. So lots of.
I really appreciate you joining us. Where can people find you? I mean, the links to your great books are going to be in the show notes, but people can find you on social media and connect up.
Yeah, on LinkedIn and X. So Richard Shotton on both. R Shotton on Twitter X, and then Richard Shotton on LinkedIn. But yeah, always good to connect.
Amazing. Yeah, as I said, I'll put it all in the show notes and the books. But look, thank you so much for taking time out and joining us. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
Oh, it was great to chat, Jan. Thank you.
And that just leaves me to thank everyone once again for joining me on the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Until next time, take care.